Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our online information and support session. A special welcome to those of you who have joined us for the first time through the NUNA notification. When a person is diagnosed with cancer, family members, friends, even coworkers often struggle to know how to help. The patient may also find that the dynamics of these relationships has shifted in unexpected ways. My name is Kathleen Helgeson, and I'm the coordinator of the Patient and Family Resource Center. I'm joined today by Melanie Baruch, counselor here at Cancer Care, who will be answering your questions about caring and connecting throughout the cancer journey. We are very pleased to offer this session with the generous funding support of the Cancer Care Manitoba Foundation. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting from all regions in Manitoba, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. It's important for us to foster inclusivity and reconciliation and encourage others to do the same. Before we continue, there are some basic Zoom features I'd like to explain. You'll notice, as an attendee, your microphone and your video are turned off. If you have a question for Melanie at any time during the presentation, just click on the Q&A icon on your screen and type your question. You can also choose to ask that question anonymously by checking the Send Anonymously box before you click on the blue arrow to send. My coworker Ellie is also here off screen and will be helping manage your questions as they come in. If you have a technical concern, you can also type your question into the Q&A and Ellie will answer your question privately and try to assist you. It's my pleasure to now introduce our guest speaker, Melanie Baruch. Melanie is a registered counselor with the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. She provides counseling to patients and families here at Cancer Care and facilitates various support groups. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and the services that are offered here at Cancer Care?
Absolutely. So I'm a counselor here at Cancer Care, and I work in the Department of Patient and Family Support Services. And myself and my colleagues work with people as they come to the cancer care system from the point of diagnosis and treatment and onwards. A lot of the work that we do with people will depend on what is most relevant to them. So sometimes the focus is more practically oriented, and sometimes it's more emotionally oriented. So for some folks that might look like navigating the medical system and sorting out things like getting time off work and accessing benefits and transportation and communication with their medical teams. And then also the really important piece of processing all the emotions that can come up for themselves and for their families when there is a cancer diagnosis. And so this is done through individual counseling, working with couples and families, and offering support groups.
And this is also, I should point out, it's a free service, right?
That is right, yes. There's no cost to any service through patient and family support services.
Thanks, Melanie. What are some of the just in terms of some of the foundational, the work that you do in terms of helping people through this process?
I think the first piece is assessing what is going on for each person and what is relevant to them, what they are seeking. People are resourceful and they have wonderful coping skills already in their lives, and this is a matter of sorting out what are they needing at a certain time. And so certainly the beginning is meeting people where they're at and then working together in a collaborative way to make a plan to move forward.
Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of coping and what that might look like?
Absolutely. I actually just want to share some slides as well as we do this. I know sometimes it can be easier to follow visually, and sometimes it's nice to be able to see a face as well. So throughout the day today, we'll go up and back from sharing some slides and talking. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And can you see my screen, Kathleen?
Yes, I can. That looks good,
Great.
Melanie.
So, this question comes up a lot, right, around coping and how to cope and what is it going to look like for me, especially at a time that can be so very overwhelming, and trying to make sense of new information and trying to make sense of perhaps a new schedule and changing health needs. And so the first thing I like to say to people is that generally speaking, people will cope with a cancer diagnosis the way they've coped their whole lives. And the really important thing to do is to find somebody in your life, whether it is a professional that is available for cancer care, whether it is somebody personal, whether it is somebody in your community that you can trust and share a little bit of your experience with them. It can be really helpful to express feelings, thoughts, and reactions because it's a lot to process. And this is the case for both patients and for families. We also know when we talk about coping, right, especially when everything can seem so very unpredictable, that the peak of stress comes at times of transition, times of uncertainty. And so to recognize that to a certain extent, distress, unfortunately, is quite normal, right? And it is not a fair expectation for the self to not experience feelings of worry or fear or distress when there is so much unknown. And so feeling these feelings is not a sign of bad coping. It's a sign of there is something very stressful that is happening that you're working on managing. Another piece around coping too is that there's no right or wrong way to react. And it can be really helpful to stay present to what you're feeling in the moment and know that no feeling is permanent. So over time, any feeling does change, so especially in those times of peak stress, knowing that it's not going to be a permanent feeling. Another piece that I'd like to point out too is that when we're talking about coping, there's two different kinds of coping that can be really helpful to realize which one a certain problem falls into. And one is, problem-based coping. And this is when a situation can be changed or solved, right? Is the answer to the uncertainty you're experiencing additional information, additional communication? Is it finding a solution to a problem? And the other piece of it is that when those feelings of stress that are coming up have to do with processing that emotions that are coming up. And this is where it can be really helpful to recognize that we're not looking for a solution, but perhaps that moment of treating oneself with kindness and self-compassion can be just so very important, or connecting with supportive people and being heard.
I mean, and this is the essence of what we're going to be talking about more today is about coping, and feedback that we've received in past webinar evaluations really highlighted that this wasn't just a challenge for the patient that has cancer, but it's also a challenge for the people in their lives. And so what we wanted to do today was to compile a list of questions that were based on comments that have been shared in past webinar evaluations, and then discuss them today with you. So one of the first questions that we found was people, of course, asking, how do you tell family and friends about your diagnosis? This is something we often hear, even in the resource center, people looking for information about how to share this.
Yeah, and that is such a good question, right? Because I think it represents too that fear that we hold when we want to share something with somebody, but are worried of how to do so and what that other person's reaction might be and how to hold space for them. And so there's a couple different considerations. There's unfortunately no to-do, no list of something that anyone must or must not do, but things that can be helpful. And it really starts with you in terms of giving some thought to recognizing what are you most comfortable sharing, right? So knowing for yourself, what are you comfortable sharing? Is there something you're not comfortable sharing? Where might you share this information? Are you going to meet this person? We certainly heard a lot through the pandemic that this wasn't possible to meet with people, to have these important conversations, and they were happening over, virtually, over video or over the phone. And so recognizing what is the space that you're going to be in, maybe asking that loved one to be available so they know that you're needing a little bit of time with them and it's not a quick conversation, and recognizing too that there will be a need to hold space for them as they process your news, because you matter to them, and it's going to take them a little bit of time to process what is being shared too. that they might have their own questions that might come up, which can be a challenge when these are questions that you share as well and don't have the answers. And so this is where sometimes having those thoughts around what can I share, what do I want to share, and maybe even sharing this is the extent of the information I have. So additional questions around this are just causing me a lot of stress right now. And as I have more information, are you going to make it available or not? Right? And there's no right or wrong answer, but it can be really helpful to know where you stand. Is there anybody that you want with you to share this information as well? Is it helpful to have a group of people or meet with people individually? So these are things that I sometimes share with people to consider for what fits best for them.
And of course, parents with young children obviously really concerned about approaching this in the right way and considering the ages and stages of their children. So what advice do you give to parents about guidelines?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I think it's really important, recognizing that as a parent, your child best, and where they're at developmentally and what information they might be able to manage. And so all this information that we give here is in the context of your expertise as the parent to know what fits best. I'm actually just going to share one more slide here as we go through this question. So with children, they have wonderful imaginations. And so whatever is not shared with them, they will work to fill in the blanks. And so this is where honesty and communication can be really important in terms of keeping them informed and telling them what to expect. And that doesn't mean sharing every detail, and it doesn't mean speaking to children at a level that is beyond their capacity for understanding. But being clear in terms of what is happening. Are there changes in their home? Are there changes to routine or to what a certain parent or extended relative might be able to do with them and what to expect? And, addressing the 4 C's, right? So what is going on for this adult in their life? The cause, right? That there's no cause in the immediate surroundings that cause the cancer. They cannot catch cancer. It is different than a cold. It's not contagious, we can still love and touch and hug that person, and it's not going to be contagious to the child. And also reassuring them of who is going to care for them, right? So sometimes those feelings for children can be centered on themselves, right? If my loved one is unwell, who is going to take care of me? And so addressing these pieces with them can be very helpful. And informing them that, it is okay to ask questions. It is okay to not have questions. It is okay to have worries, and that the adults in the home are safe people to talk to about this topic.
Melanie, one of the other questions that we often hear too is about the work situation. And we know that a lot of people continue to work even through treatment. Other people take some time off, but are patients obligated to tell their employer what's going on, or are there privacy issues around that? Can you speak a little bit about the situation at work?
For sure. And these are such great questions. So the short and very clear answer is no. No, you do not have to share anything about your health that is personal to you that you don't want to share. It gets, sometimes there's a desire to share. There are close relationships with people at work, with one's manager, and you may want to share. Again, how much you share or don't share is up to you. Sometimes when there's conversations around accommodations, then there's a need to share what might need to be accommodated. In discussions around taking time off work, this is something that can be handled with a medical note. And so if somebody does not want to share and is uncomfortable sharing, they don't need to. They can provide a medical note that will be brief, that might state that somebody needs to be off work or needs to reduce their work hours, or as they're returning to work, that they are, they can be involved in a gradual return to work program, and kind of detailing what that might look like as well.
And there are some people that are very private about their cancer diagnosis and really don't want anybody to know. I'm just wondering, are there implications for that when somebody is kind of withholding that information and just not wanting to share it with anybody in their life?
So I think, I love these kinds of questions because I think they also highlight how different people can be, how some people might feel comfortable being very open and others not. And I don't think that there are implications per se. I think it's really important to respect people's boundaries with what they feel comfortable with. And so if we're focusing on implications, if we will, it's just a matter of sometimes when others don't know what you're going through, they cannot be there to support you. But for some people, that privacy is very important, and that is okay. Right. And so I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer to how much one shares. And we're talking both, on a personal level and just going back to that workplace question as well. Right. A lot of these things really come down to what you're most comfortable with. And I think it's important to recognize, too, that what somebody is most comfortable with might change over time, where perhaps initially this is information that you just want to keep really to yourself and perhaps immediate family. And especially when somebody is feeling understandably just so overwhelmed, there isn't a desire to talk about what they're feeling. And as they feel more comfortable and understanding of what is going on, perhaps, certainly once people meet their medical team and kind of have a sense of what treatment looks like and what it feels like and the effect of it, it can become a little bit easier to talk about it.
I think, Melanie, you'd had some resources as well that you had mentioned to me about the work situation.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I just want to address or bring up for people, if you want to read more and in more detail about your rights, about information, about returning to work, about cancer and work more broadly, cancerandwork.ca is an excellent website that has a lot of information from having certain conversations with the employer to assessing for yourself, am I ready to go back to work? Am I ready to work part-time? How can I manage, assessing those physical abilities as well as cognitively? We know that, certain treatments can impact one's cognition as well. And there are also some really wonderful articles about exercising your power of disclosure as well. So yes, it's cancerandwork.ca.
That's great. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about one of the comments that, or not one, but many comments that we've often received in evaluation feedback about loneliness and isolation. And I guess this also speaks to the fact that we were doing a lot of these webinars through the pandemic. And so those feelings of isolation were really heightened for people. But I think a cancer diagnosis, even in these times when there aren't as many restrictions, can still be or feel isolating. Can you talk a little bit about that and how one can alleviate that?
Absolutely. So there's a couple different ways that we could look at this, right? Because there's the actual, physical isolation, because even though, we certainly are living with the same restrictions, pandemic-related restrictions that we saw a couple of years ago, for a lot of people, they've applied restrictions in their lives to keep themselves safe or keep their family members safe. And so even though the world has opened up, if you will, that doesn't always translate to everybody's lifestyle. And so that isolation is still very present and very real. And I think sometimes can even be more challenging when you're staying home to protect yourself, but perhaps, your extended family, your friends or loved ones are out and about and doing other things. There's also the piece around that emotional isolation, right? When going through something really hard, there could be a very strong sense, a very real sense of, do other people understand what I'm going through? Can they understand what I'm going through? And not for lack of desire and not for lack of support and love, but that sense of maybe they can't quite understand what I'm going through and it's really hard to be in this. And that applies to both patients and caregivers, right? This experience that I'm in is very intense. And and maybe friends and family can't quite relate to what this is. And then it can be hard to communicate that, to have them really understand. And so I think this is just such an important question, right, of how to cope with this isolation and loneliness. And so I think the first thing is to realize that it is really normal to feel these feelings, but I think they're also information to work with. They're an indication that something is missing. Maybe that desire to be heard, to be understood, to be connected with people, and what that might look like now, given what life looks like now. Is it extending those connections to new people? Is it joining support groups? Is it connecting with a counselor? Is it working on strengthening existing relationships in your life and working communicating those needs? And I want to recognize, I just really acknowledge though, that sometimes it can be work. It can be work, especially when you're feeling alone. It can feel like a lot of work to reach out and do those things. And but it's so important. It's so important to make sure to have somebody that you can feel connected to. And even things like joining here today, right? I know that I can't see your faces and I wish that I could, but even connecting with the content, right? And hearing from people, whether it is people like Kathleen and myself, whether it is other patients, connecting with information online in a way that is safe, right? These are all ways that we can normalize the feelings that might be coming up and access resources as well.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning also, Melanie, about just the challenge of reaching out, because it's not an easy thing to overcome when you're feeling lonely and isolated, to, like, as you say, to have the energy even to put that work into, creating connections. But it is important to try to do that. I did have a question from one of our attendees I just wanted to relate to you. I am the grandmother with cancer. My daughters have not shared the news with the kids who are 12, 10, and 4. They want to do so, I guess, when she actually has a surgery date. So she thought, the question was, should she deliver the news to them, or should the mothers, I guess, of the children? Should the grandmother share the news, or the mothers? And one of the daughters is afraid of using the term cancer itself. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the question. I love to see questions come up, and this is a really hard thing to balance, of knowing how to share this. I think it's different for each family, depending on family dynamics and the relationships, and especially in your case, what you're wanting to do, which is to share with them, and also respecting your daughter's desire to perhaps keep the cancer word out. And we hear that a lot. Cancer is a very scary word, and not wanting to introduce that. So there isn't a right or a wrong, but I think it would be important for you to speak with your daughter so that you're all on the same page in terms of how you might want to share it. Do you want to be there? Are you comfortable answering questions from your grandchildren? Kids sometimes, especially the 10 and 12-year-old, might be very tuned in to the fact that there's changes in the family, and what does it mean, right? And what are things going to look like, and what is the health issue that has entered the picture that is causing these changes. And so I think it starts out with a conversation in the family. There's really, really wonderful resources too in the Patient and Family Resource Center that get into a lot more detail about things to consider depending on people, children's age groups, and kind of managing those pieces as well. And so I would certainly encourage, before having these conversations, if you're feeling those concerns, and I think most parents and grandparents do before having these conversations, is maybe to check out some of these resources. And Kathleen is the go-to person for them. So she's the one that you would contact.
Yeah, and I will share at the end of our presentation the phone number for the resource center to call. Just kind of keeping on with this discussion about sharing news with family and friends and perhaps coworkers even. What type of responses could one expect in sharing this news with others? I'm sure there's as unique as each person is, there's quite a range of responses, and I'm I wonder if sometimes if we have a certain expectation that people will respond a certain way, and how we would feel when they don't, or if they respond in ways that we didn't anticipate. Could you just
Yeah. And that comes up a lot, right? That sense of I thought a loved one might respond a certain way and they didn't, and maybe there's feelings of hurt or disappointment for that, right? And so to answer the first part of the question, how might people respond? I think that'll line up with their personalities and their own understanding of the situation. So it's certainly kind of when we think of how we might respond to any change in another person's health that we care about, right? In terms of there being heightened emotion, and fear, and worry, and maybe that's followed by a lot of questions or tears or shock, a desire to be really, really involved, right? And sometimes the opposite. Sometimes there can be a sense of people are very uncomfortable, and not because they're not wanting to be supportive, but there's a sense of kind of backing off because maybe they don't want to cause stress, they don't want to ask something that is inappropriate, and in their own fear or discomfort, they kind of back away. And that's one where we hear a lot. Sometimes that's where there can be a lot of hurt. Sometimes people are really wonderfully proactive and wanting to know how to best help. How can I be supportive? How can I be there for you? And so these are some of the questions that might come up as well, in addition to those questions about the medical status of each person's health.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of what we can say and do to perhaps be helpful. There is a comment or a question here too about just that a lot of people don't like to use the word cancer, and when does one become more comfortable saying that word, I guess. And I think this is natural with things that we fear. I mean, we want to avoid the things that we fear. We don't want to face them, and facing it is saying it, right? And naming it.
Mm-hmm. No, and that is so true, right? It is not comfortable to sit with things that are uncomfortable and scary and unknown. And to say the word out loud and to share it with people can make it very real. And I think that comes back to that point around what are you comfortable sharing? And it's okay to have a limit to what that is. And if using the word cancer is something that is not fitting for you, that does not feel right for you, then that kind of becomes that line. I think when that changes, there isn't a specific time, right? I don't think discomfort is it's not there isn't a certain kind of milestone that we'll reach in terms of comfort with this. I think it's for each person a sense of understanding of their illness, maybe comfort with understanding what is going on and what does treatment look like, and what impact is it having on your life and your energy and your health, and knowing the people around you and kind of how they might react as well. I also just want to add, kind of speaking about others' reactions, is that we can't control the reactions of other people, right? It's something that is out of our hands, how they might respond or not respond. And recognizing that when you're entering a difficult conversation, part of what you're also doing is wearing a couple of different hats, and that you're sharing this information, and you're maybe wearing the hat of an educator, but you're also perhaps wearing the hat of a person who is holding space for your loved one who is now processing something difficult that you've now had a little bit of time to process as well. And so recognizing that it can be emotionally heavy as well. So kind of keeping that in mind as you enter these conversations too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an additional kind of task to hold space for the people in your life, because they're having to process it when you're going through it yourself and processing a lot. So I think,
and I think that's something that a lot of people comment on, perhaps being surprising, is the effort that needs to go into sharing and being there and wanting to hold that space, but that it can be very tiring too.
Just maybe we'll just take a moment right here just to launch one of our polls, just so we can get some input from our audience. So I'm just going to send a poll to your screen with a question for all, like whether you're a patient or a caregiver. So this question here should be showing up on your screen. If it doesn't show up on your screen, it may just be that your computer doesn't support it. But the question is, what communication strategies have you used to ask for what you want and need? So that can be either a patient or family member responding, sharing my feelings, suggesting possible solutions, creating boundaries and saying no, and considering the timing of your request. So we'll just give you a moment to vote on those responses, and then I'll ask Melanie to comment a little bit on that. We have our largest group ever that we've had for our webinar today, so it's going to just take a little bit longer. But maybe Melanie, while those responses are coming in, somebody's also asked about what can you tell people when they ask how you're doing, but you're having a bad day with side effects and are tired of talking about it? Is it, I guess, is it okay to say I don't want to talk about it, or I just tired of talking about this right now?
Yes, it is very okay. It is very, very okay to say, I really appreciate you checking in, and I do want to talk at some point, but today I don't want to get into that topic. And maybe to follow that is, can we talk about something else if you do want to engage in a conversation? Or I need some space today. I need to rest today, and kind of expressing what your need might be in that moment, so that that other person, you're holding true to what you need at that moment in time. And you're letting the person that you're appreciating that check-in, but other people checking in does not mean that you kind of owe people information about you if you're not in that headspace or emotional space or physical space to share.
Okay, great. Do you want to comment on the results there, Melanie? We have a good chunk of people that have already voted on it.
I don't see them.
Oh,
I don't see the results.
I need to end it. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so there you should see the results now.
Okay, yeah, they just came up here. So what I'm seeing here, what's come up is in terms of what communication strategies have you used to ask for what you want and need. The majority at 79% said share my feelings. At 38% suggest possible solutions. At 22% create boundaries and say no. And 31% consider the timing of my request. These are all good strategies, and I think they all have a time and place depending on what you're needing. But I just love seeing here that people are open with what they're feeling and what they're needing from the people around them. And so it seems like, for sure, kind of voicing what you're needing, what you're feeling, is that first step in communicating with others.
And that answer that you were giving to that last question about being able to say, I don't feel like talking about this, is really about the idea of boundaries, right? In terms of being able to say, I'm just not in frame of mind to want to talk about this today, and being able to say, no, I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, and those boundaries, they're so important, but it's important to recognize they can change from moment to moment, they can change from day to day, because how you feel on a certain day might look very different than how you feel at a different day or different time, when there's more or less energy, or that desire to connect is stronger. And sometimes, just wanting to be on your own and rest is also important too. And so that checking in with yourself to know what you're needing is so crucial.
So on the opposite end of that spectrum, there's a question from somebody about what to do when family and friends don't want to talk about your cancer or ask how you're doing.
Well, I guess I would be curious to know, when we're kind of thinking about checking in with someone that we care about and they don't want to talk, we do that because we care. And it's also sometimes our need to want to know how they're doing because we're worried about them. So I think it's important to recognize that as friends and family and caregivers, you're going to have your own feelings about what is, what is going on, and what that, your loved one is needing, that may not align with how they're feeling and what they want to be doing. And that's where recognizing that maybe you're sitting with that uncertainty now because you really care about this person and they're not giving you that information on what they're needing or how they're doing. And you still care about them and you still want to be there, but perhaps they've set that boundary in that moment because that's what they're needing.
Okay. So Melanie, just to clarify that when somebody's family and friends aren't asking, is there anything you can do as the person with cancer? Yeah, if they
I think I misheard that.
That's okay. It's all good information. But yeah, the question was specifically when friends and family don't ask and aren't asking about your cancer or how you're feeling.
So when you are the patient and friends and family are not asking, that feeling of, I think that unfortunately happens a lot, right? Is that sense of everybody's trying to find their footing on what is kind of okay or not okay to say. And I guess what I'm wondering about, and I know that I can only answer based on that one question there, but I would wonder, do friends and family feel like it's okay to ask? What I see more often than not is that the caring for and the love and the thinking about that person is there. But sometimes the barrier is people don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't know how to ask. And there's that sense of, well, if I just say nothing, then I'm not going to upset them. On the flip side of that, it can be really hurtful and it can leave the patient feeling really alone when the people who care about you most aren't asking. And so I wonder about either sharing proactive updates or when somebody does ask, letting them know how much you appreciate it. Or when people ask, is there anything that I can do to help? To say, actually, it's really helpful when you check in, even if I'm not proactive with this information. Can you call me once in a while and check in? And it can feel sometimes weird to ask that, but it's so important, right? Because in moments where you're experiencing perhaps fatigue and it's hard to keep track of what's going on, it can be helpful to have those people check in.
I think that's a really valuable thing that you just mentioned about asking somebody to check in with them, even if they haven't asked, because I think as a caregiver or somebody, that knows somebody in their life with cancer, sometimes you can feel as though that you're trivializing it somehow. How are you doing? It sounds almost trivial when you know that the person is coping with something, as difficult as this. And so, as you said, sometimes people will don't know how to approach it. It's not because they're not concerned. They just don't know how to approach it without sounding like that it's trivial or that, that somehow minimizing it in some way.
Yeah. And I think a really good thing to do too is to actually acknowledge that, to say, I actually don't know how to ask and I don't know what to say, but I want you to know that I'm thinking about you and I'm wondering how today is going.
Mm-hmm. And there may also be, I'm thinking too, that concern about interfering or somehow undermining that person's independence. Like that if I continue to ask them, they're going to think that I'm not capable of doing anything on my own, or, so I don't want to interfere or just undermine their independence somehow. So there's all these things that you might anticipate, and then that would maybe block you from wanting to ask how people are doing and what you can do to help.
As you're talking, the word that comes to my mind, or the metaphor, is almost that one of a very delicate dance. And one of the things that happens when there's something really big that changes in life is that perhaps the way that we communicate with others or connect with others has changed as well. And that it can take a little bit of time to for both parties, right, to find their footing of, how do we connect now? What is the best way for us to connect now? And sometimes it actually requires an active conversation about, we're doing things a little bit differently. So what do we need to be doing to feel like us, whoever that us might be?
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, acknowledging that the situation itself has perhaps created a new way of approaching communication, and maybe some challenges are going to come up and we need to keep talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good advice. There's a comment here from somebody that she's a mother of a beautiful daughter dealing with breast cancer. And she has 2 daughters, which are learning to cope with the new world. It breaks my heart to not always know how to be supportive. And she doesn't want to add stress to all of them. So this is something I think too that people fear, that they're going to impose their own stress and anxiety on the situation.
Mm-hmm. I really want to acknowledge how hard it is to be so close to someone and care about them so very much and know that they're struggling, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional. It's, to witness somebody else's suffering can just be so hard. And this is where, when we talk about support, that support extends to the patient, and it extends to the family, and it extends to whoever is the loved one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any thoughts or ideas about communicating with family who live further away? They don't see you directly, maybe, and aren't there sort of on a day-to-day basis, so that you can ask for support from them. Are there ways that they can also have a supportive relationship when their family isn't here?
So I think that the question that comes to my mind when I hear that is, what might be the support that would be helpful, right? So for the patient and their immediate family, what kind of support would they be looking for? So is the person asking the question the family that is abroad or away, or is the person asking the question the patient?
I'm assuming the person is the patient and the family lives far away.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's when people live far away, there's almost like an additional burden of having to be extra clear with communication, because they're not necessarily able to see you. And so I kind of wonder about what might be helpful, right? Is it that ongoing connection? Is what's helpful actually connecting and not talking about cancer at all? There's now more virtual ways than ever to remain connected in a really amazing way. I know people that will get together and watch a movie online together and spend a couple hours, and maybe 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been something that would have come to mind to do. And sometimes there's more practical things, like we need actual practical support, and the family that's away might want to contribute to that in some way. And so I think it depends on what is the need that is important to fill.
Mm-hmm. And then goes back to kind of the challenge of being able to ask for, what you need and what could be helpful in this case. And that may be, as you say, maybe it's still more virtual contact, but even that might feel supportive and reassuring in this situation.
And I recognize that as I'm saying all this, how much work is being put on the patient and family to identify what is needed and what would be helpful. And then on the flip side of that, I've seen other extended family or friends, share that they will offer certain practical advice, such as, instead of that open question of, is there anything I can do to help, to say something like, can I come shovel your driveway? I'm at the grocery store. Is there anything that I can pick up for you to save you the trip? Is there any food that would be helpful if I cook for you? So sometimes those very practical things, and kind of honing in on what is the support that you can give, and might they want that, and then giving that option.
Mm-hmm. Are there other, I guess, emotional things that can be said at the time when a family member or a friend learns of this news from somebody? Are there things things not to say, maybe I should put it that way, that aren't helpful that you've heard?
So what is not helpful can look different from person to person. So I want to preface that before I answer the question, right? But sometimes something that stands out a lot is that sense of being overly positive. And that is such a tough one, right? Because that positivity and hope and support comes from such a loving place. And yet it can sometimes be taken from the perspective of, maybe not quite feeling like one's experience is being seen. That at a time where there is fear and uncertainty, what can be helpful is actually to recognize this is a really hard time right now, and it's really hard to sit in this, and I'm here for you. And that sometimes we see that really well-meaning and kind cheerleading language, if you will, for some people can really be hurtful and make them feel like they're not quite being heard. We also hear a lot sometimes about sharing a lot of details about other people's experiences that can be very scary to hear as well. And so I kind of wonder about the what not to say, because it can be so personal to say, what is helpful for me to say, right? Or to recognize we're all people, and people sometimes say the wrong thing. And even if it can be well-meaning, it happens. And focusing on what could be most helpful.
Yeah, good point. Again, just in terms of looking at not just the individual, but the dynamics of that relationship, the type of relationship that exists, the type of rapport that person has with them, and some things that we might think are inappropriate, other people would just laugh at and just think, well, that's just how they are, and they're well-meaning, and not think anything of it. So I think it's but I guess again, when you're not the person that has cancer, I think you're sometimes very overly sensitive to upsetting the person that has the diagnosis, and maybe to the point where you start censoring yourself in terms of thinking, oh, I better not say that, or that might be upsetting, or I'm not sure if I'm interfering, and start really second guessing yourself a lot.
And I think that's where kind of recognizing the impact of cancer on relationships can be so intricate sometimes, and that, yes, it can go into that moment where all of a sudden you're censoring yourself and you're behaving in different ways, and it's hard to know how to be. And so I think recognizing one's own anxiety about things that have changed, about dynamics that might have changed. I always encourage people that if they're feeling like they're lacking information, if information is going to help them feel more prepared, that information, is something that they can access, that is available. If having a conversation about these changes is helpful, connecting with a counselor to discuss perhaps what these relationship changes look like, and how to be there for someone in a way that feels supportive and right for that particular relationship, because it's so different from person to person.
There was a comment that had been expressed in one of our past webinars, and it's kind of related to what we're talking about right now. Someone had used the term cancer ghosting and said that was a phenomenon where people just basically abandon the person that has cancer, friends and family, that once they find out, they kind of disappear. It's not a term that I had heard before, but I just wonder if you've heard it, and this person had just expressed it was very painful to go through that.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it is so painful, and there can be so much hurt and disappointment that comes when there's somebody who you think that is going to be there for you, or that perhaps somebody who's reached out who you haven't connected with in a while, and they kind of become involved in your life, and all of a sudden they've just disappeared. So that term cancer ghosting refers to when somebody just kind of disappears. And I think this is one of those examples where we can really say it is not you, it is them, in that people, generally speaking, ghost because of their own emotions, because of their own discomfort, because they maybe don't quite know how to be there or what to say, and that can become such a barrier. They just kind of back off. Sometimes people think that they are doing something that is actually kind, that they just want to give you space, if they will, and they kind of make that decision on their own without it being a conversation. But it can really feel like this person who I care about so much is just stepped away from the relationship that we used to have. And it's hard because it can represent one additional loss.
And is that how you would process it with a patient if you were as a loss, or would you encourage them to communicate with this person that's kind of disappeared out of their life?
I think it really depends based on the circumstance. But I think even if that relationship is repaired, there's a disappointment to cope with and to recognize that perhaps you had a certain image of who might be there and who might be supportive, and the fact that it did not quite look that way. On the flip side of that, we do often hear that people tend to be surprised at the people who step up and become really meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just in terms of the caregiver role again, and the responsibility maybe of the primary caregiver, what impact can that have on the relationship with the cancer patient? So I would think that, and this is something again that's been expressed in our feedback on webinars, that there may be some stress and resentment and some guilt that begins to impact their relationship if somebody's feeling that they're spending all their energy, all their time taking care of the person with cancer.
Yes to all, and I'll elaborate on that. When we talk about caregiving, caregiving can look, there's a whole range of what caregiving is, right? From supporting a loved one emotionally, to helping them manage appointments and medications and treatments, to providing more hands-on care at home. All those pieces are pieces that have to do with caregiving. And I think it's important to recognize that people do this because they really love their loved ones and they want to be there and they really care. But the reality is that at a time that is emotionally heightened for everyone, and all these additional tasks maybe in the picture, and perhaps the roles in one's home that were there before are now different, and that caregiver is taking on more, it can lead to a sense of burnout, because people are human and there's only so much they can do. And so when we think about, from a caregiver perspective, your own emotional processing, the changes that you're experiencing in your loved one, and that you're processing that, and that might come with, its own worries and sadness and fear. And then also actually doing all the tasks that you're doing, it's really just so understandable how there can be feelings of frustration, or sometimes guilt, if you want to take the time to yourself to take care of yourself, but your loved one can.
Oh, you just
I
froze
step away to do it. Oh,
yeah, you just froze for.
Am I back?
You're back. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, you just froze. Are we good?
We're good. Yeah.
Okay. I was just saying it is just so very understandable how there can be feelings of guilt, and yes, sometimes resentment and sometimes anger, and it has so much to do with the changes in relationship and the situation that is causing so much stress. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of those times where I really would say, if you're noticing that in yourself, first of all, those are incredibly understandable and normal and common feelings, given how much you are doing and how much life has changed and all the emotions that are coming up. But also it can be really helpful to talk to someone about this, whether it's in the context of kind of one-on-one counseling, whether it's in the context of a support group. It can be really helpful to have a space where you can let some of those feelings out, and know that there's no shame associated with that. And in fact, the reason that people get themselves in a situation where they're giving so much that it is actually causing these feelings is because they care so much, right? There's that sense of, I care about my person so much that if they need something, I'm going to do it, even if it means that perhaps sleep is lost and life balance is lost, and it's a clear answer. Then the impact of those losses, they catch up.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a moment just to launch the second poll on that note, because it's relating to caregivers. So I'm just going to do that right now. So you should be seeing a question on your screen related to caregiving, and it's asking, what challenges have you faced as a caregiver? So even if you're currently a person with cancer, you've probably been in the role of a caregiver before. So if you wanted to reflect and share your thoughts on this poll: coping with my own feelings, finding the resources needed to help, having the energy to be emotionally and physically available, or juggling my other responsibilities with being a caregiver. While we wait for those results to come in, Melanie, just a question here also about, handling the situation when the caregiver or the spouse that is the caregiver is actually coping worse emotionally than the patient.
I'm really glad this question was asked, this comment/question, because this is true. This is true for a lot of people, in that sometimes the patient is actually coping well, and they feel that they have a sense of perhaps control over their health in that given time. That as a caregiver, you're seeing things from a different lens, and it can be incredibly emotionally distressing. And so how two people cope, even in a relationship, can be so different. And, we see this from kind of anecdotally, and also what the research says about caregivers, that caregivers do tend to experience more distress. In fact, I think it was actually in one of my slides a little bit earlier too, about how this tends to be the case. And so this is where we're talking about checking in with yourself and what you need. It can look very different from what your partner or loved one might need. And it's important to seek that support if you're noticing that in yourself.
Yeah, somebody else also had shared this similar kind of thought. They'd said that they're very open about telling everyone, their friends, family, neighbors, about their cancer, and they feel quite badly when they see that other people seem more deeply affected than they themselves are, and how to cope with that, watching other people struggle with it.
Yeah, and I guess what I want to say in response to that question is that I don't think there's a way to share hard information, to share difficult information, and have other people not feel sadness or fear or worries because they care. And so I know there's such a desire to be able to share this and kind of shield your loved ones from those emotions. But the reality is that they're going to be there because they're a presence in your life, and there's somebody who cares about your well-being. But I really, I hear you in what you're saying, that it's hard to do that, to know that you're sharing this and that you're seeing that in them.
I'm going to share the results of that poll with you right now. Melanie, are you seeing the results now?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you. So just to recap the question, what challenges have you faced as a caregiver? And so 62% said coping with my own feelings. 49% said having the energy to be emotionally and physically available. 38% said juggling my other responsibilities with being a caregiver. And 27% said finding the resources needed to help. So the first thing that I want to comment on is how high these numbers are, and just the commonalities, and that, we have 120 some folks having joined us here today, and everyone's got their own experiences and responsibilities, and yes, the commonality in these feelings, right? And that how, especially coping with your own feelings, especially when we don't expect certain feelings to come up, we kind of have this mindset of I just want to do certain things to support my loved one, and yet it is not free of emotion, right? And those fears and those worries, and perhaps even the grief over a former, lifestyle that was there, or plans that are not happening. They're all things that are coming up. Kind of noticing too, having the energy, right? So juggling a lot of life responsibilities in addition to being a caregiver, right? So that sense of life has not stopped, and things, still need to be done, and both in terms of juggling lots of responsibilities and work, and having that energy, it can really be a lot.
I'm just going to stop sharing that now. I think one of the things that you just spoke to right there is very important to maybe just restate, is the losses of maybe plans that were made together as a family that have to be put on hold, and just the hardship of going through that as, as a family or friends of somebody, where the things that you dreamt of doing and wanted to do together are now put on hold. There's a huge loss there for everyone.
Yes, it is. And even though sometimes our heads can make sense of certain situations, and they can kind of look at facts and make plans and kind of make action-oriented decisions, our hearts tend to be sometimes a bit slower to follow. And those feelings will come up, and those feelings of loss will certainly come up.
Mm-hmm. What type of supports are there for caregivers? Somebody's asking about, is there a support group for caregivers? Is there also groups for partners who have somebody that in treatment that may have children? Are there supports like this available?
Yeah, so I want to actually, I'll answer this question in two ways. The short answer is yes, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. But I just want to actually bring everyone's attention to the Navigator, which is a monthly newsletter that is put out by the Department of Patient and Family Support Services. It has an up-to-date list on all the support groups and resources that are available. And you can call the department and ask for a hard copy, and you can also go online and look up the Navigator and the month you're looking for, and it'll come up. And so that is the best and most up-to-date way to find out what programs are running and how to access them, because the contact information will be on there. But in terms of supports available, yes, there is a caregiver support group that is available. There is individual support that is available. And I think too, now more than ever, there's supports online that are sometimes open to caregivers broadly, and sometimes that are specific to certain types of cancer as well, that are more specific in that way too.
And for people that have children, for people with cancer that have children, are there specific supports available for maybe some of the challenges that they face?
There's not a specific group for parents that have children. What I do find is there's a lot of overlapping themes that people experience, even when their families, have different structures. And so certainly caregivers that have children can certainly come to the caregiver support group as well.
Okay. There was a question here, and from one of our attendees that mentioned that that she has a teenager that's embarrassed of how she looks since she's gone through treatment and has lost her hair, and that the teenager doesn't want anyone at school knowing about the situation, finds it very awkward. So she says that they've had several discussions over this and the impact that that's kind of had, the strain, I guess, that it's put on the relationship. And it's created more social or physical distancing between them, and some emotional distancing. Any suggestions about shifting what's going on there in terms of the distancing that she's feeling right now?
Well, my first thought is that it would be good to explore this, I think, in more depth. And so my initial thought is that it might be helpful to connect with a counselor one-on-one, because I'm hearing a couple of things happening. There's, your son's own coping with the situation and his feelings about it. There's a changing relationship dynamics, and then that added isolation piece. So a couple of different layers there. So no immediate advice necessarily, but it sounds like it would be very hard to have this going on, and I certainly would encourage you to reach out to connect with someone about this in more depth.
Yeah, thank you. Just before we go on to some of the other questions, and we do have time, so if you have questions for Melanie, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. We've also had comments from people in the webinar evaluations about moving forward after cancer, after treatment is over, that people also have expectations. Family members may have expectations that now they're good. Now they're finished treatment. They should just bounce back to where they were at prior to their diagnosis. They should be able to do the things that they did before. that everything should just go back to kind of normal, and the person that's in recovery and from treatment is not feeling that way and not feeling understood. Any thoughts around those situations?
Yeah, that time of recovery and survivorship, I think, brings with it some unexpected feelings and maybe sometimes challenges, in that as one is in treatment, there can be a real sense of, I'm going to put one foot in front of the other and focus on this treatment, and that expectation for both the patient and the families that, when you're at the end of treatment, that is done. And what we see, a lot of the time, is that actually it's at the point of at the end of treatment that a lot of the feelings that there wasn't much time to process tend to come up. And they can actually be really overwhelming. This is for both the patient and the family. On the flip side of that, especially when there are no physical changes, there can be that sense of, okay, this is done and we're back to normal, but there can be still a long road of recovery, depending on what, someone might have gone through. And there is that lack of perhaps understanding from the family. And so I just first of all want to say, yes, this is something that comes up because it's unexpected, right? Because there's this timeline perhaps sometimes in our heads that we carry, that if treatment is a certain duration, at the end of it, there's a desire for things to go back to normal, but that recovery, after treatment, there's a time of recovery. And this is where I encourage people to have conversations with their medical team about understanding, what does recovery look like and what can they expect, and maybe sharing this information also, so that there aren't undue expectations that are being put on them to do more than is reasonable for where they're at.
Yeah, it's a challenge when family members are, as you say, they're hopeful and they're being optimistic, and they want to put it behind them and say, like, okay, let's just get back to normal now, and we can function normally again. And so the person had, written the comment that it was really frustrating because their spouse thinks that they're just being lazy because they don't want to do all the things that they did before, and that it's quite a struggle coping with that situation.
Yeah, and I just want to say it's just so very rare that somebody's recovery has in it laziness. I mean, recovery can be so much slower than expected sometimes. And it is hard when that recovery, the recovery is invisible, because the recovery, that time of recovery is not necessarily filled with appointments or with certain milestones. It's a time that can be slower, and that it can look slower, but it is so very different than somebody not wanting to or not trying to take really good care of themselves. And so this is where I wonder about kind of gathering more information so that everybody's expectations can be on the same page. And it might mean some re-education of and changing some of these expectations so that they are supportive to the patient who is working on recovering.
Another comment that had been made once before was that they felt that their spouse was not as supportive or as comforting as they would like that person to be. And that person also wasn't willing to go to counseling. So what does one do when their partner doesn't want to go to counseling and their patient is not feeling supported or comforted in the way they would like to be?
So I kind of go back to that comment we made earlier, and that we cannot control anyone else's behaviors or reactions, right? We as people don't have control over anybody else, and everyone has the right to react and to be the way that is coming up for them. But my thought is around that patient and making sure to find adequate supports. If it's not their partner, then maybe other people in that person's life, whether it is other family or friends or a counselor or their physician, right? Kind of who is that person's team of support that is going to help them feel understood and supported.
So just reaching beyond their immediate relationship and looking for other supports.
Yes.
A few questions here that I'd like to also get to. So one was, and this is a difficult question, of course, to answer, but does it take a certain amount of time for someone to accept their cancer?
This is a really, really good question. And I wish I could provide a kind of a solid answer, because there can be so much comfort in knowing that if something were to take a certain number of weeks or months, then we kind of wait to reach that point in time. But in terms of does it take a certain amount of time, I think it really varies. It really varies for each person. And it's hard to, there's no time frame that can be given as a direct answer. I think there's a shift in how people feel about it, and there's a shift in their understanding, and there's a shift, once people put a face to who their medical team is, and maybe what life looks like, and how their bodies are doing, and what helps them and what doesn't help them. And once all these pieces, they're able to make sense of all these pieces, it can help. But unfortunately, there's no direct answer for a certain timeline. I wish I could provide one, but no.
In the cases of a terminal diagnosis or an advanced cancer diagnosis, are there other specific supports and considerations that might be helpful?
So I think in terms of other supports, I think the supports themselves are similar to what we've mentioned in terms of how valuable it can be to spend that time kind of focusing on what are the emotions that are coming up and what are your needs right now. Something that that comes up a lot for people is that desire to focus on what they can focus on and what they can control, and ways to help their families. And so this is where sometimes people find comfort in the very difficult tasks, but of doing things like advanced care planning and working on, organizing their affairs from a perspective of, I can't manage this illness, but I can protect my family and I can do certain things, and that can bring with it, a decrease in anxiety and worry. But from an emotional perspective, the answer isn't different. It looks different in how it's processed. And so I think seeking support is really important. And that goes, by the way, for the patient and the family, because things they move faster, right? And they move really fast, and it's just so much. It can be such a whirlwind of information, and just life changes.
Another question related to the supports. Somebody's asked if they haven't really connected or clicked with the counselor that they've been assigned to. Is it a possibility to request a new counselor?
Yes, absolutely. If somebody's not a good fit, I think what's really important here are your needs and what's going on for you. And sometimes it happens that two people are not a good fit. And so you can let the counselor know that maybe you want to work with somebody else. If that's not comfortable and that's understandable, you can call the department and say, I'm looking to connect with somebody new. Can you make that referral?
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Somebody else just wanted to mention there was a question, I guess, or not a question, but a suggestion. Someone had asked about what they can do to be helpful, and I think that was for the patient that may have been at a distance, like in terms of where they were living, but talking about ordering online or having home meals delivered. So and you were mentioning too about sort of doing these concrete things that could really be helpful to the person with cancer. Yeah. Another question, in terms of the emotional recovery, again, I guess this is about survivorship. And he's finding, that self-worth and sort of mental health there's still work there to do.
I think the time of recovery is a time where there can be just a flood of emotions, and there can be a lot that stays with you as you're trying to make sense of what you've just gone through. And part of that is reevaluating so much of perhaps what life used to look like and what you might want life to look like, and what pieces of yourself you want to bring with you, what pieces of yourself are hurting and need more attending to. And so I guess that the first thing I want to say to that is is how common it is to have big emotional pieces that you're working with in a time of survivorship and recovery. And that is why, you know, counseling services don't end the day treatment ends. And it's very common to actually just reach out for support at that point in time, because there can be a sense of, I might actually now have enough time to even focus on what I might want to work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely the fear of reoccurrence and the anxiety around that is a very real experience for
Yes.
people, even years out from treatment, that they will be overwhelmed with that fear that their cancer could reoccur.
Yes, and I think something that's important to recognize is that these feelings, they can come and go, right? And so especially when you're talking about fear of recurrence, it can be heightened by certain triggers, right? So by certain dates or certain appointments or follow-up scans, or by hearing the news of somebody else's cancer diagnosis, or sometimes even watching, you know, television or a movie and unexpectedly there's a cancer theme in there, and that can be very triggering too. And so recognizing that just for the folks that are hearing this that don't have this coming up, that it's not, it can be very overwhelming, and it can be there too much, if you will, but it also, people can be coping quite well and have moments where this can be very intense too. Mm-hmm. And so there's a real spectrum of how the fear of recurrence can present.
Right, so that it can be, as you say, something triggered and they may feel it for a while and then it will subside, and it's not necessarily going to be like anything, an ongoing thing. It could come and go.
And it can be both, depending on where people are at, right? And usually the further out somebody is from treatment, the less intense that is.
Thank you. We do have time for some more questions. If you have anything more that you'd like to ask Melanie, or anything that we've not talked about during this discussion, please let us know. Melanie, did you want to share your slide of resources though in the meantime? And
sure. I'm just going to pull it up here.
And then after you do that, I'll also give the number for the resource center as well.
Sorry, Kathleen, it's just taking me a second here.
No problem.
So, oops. Can you see my slide there?
I can, yeah.
So there's a couple of wonderful websites online. Cancerandwork.ca we mentioned. BC Cancer Agency has a lot of just really phenomenal resources online. Canadian Virtual Hospice, and then of course the Patient and Family Resource Center. I think if you're looking for something more specific, I really would encourage you to reach out to the Resource Center. I did tell people that kind of Googling something sometimes can do more harm than good. You know, we live in a time where it's just so easy to access information, and a lot of our go-tos is to grab our phones or devices and look something up, but recognizing that sometimes doing so can bring on a lot of unwanted information. And so if you're seeking something out, one of the kind of the better ways to go about it in a way that is kind to you and to what you might want to see is to go directly to the source of what you might be looking for, and then to search through a website that is reputable and that is current, so that you know that you're getting accurate information.
Yeah, and we can help advise people here too in the Resource Center about what some of those sites might be that would be reliable. I'm just going to share that information with you right now as well. So I'm not sure if you're seeing that there, but this is our number here at 675 McDermott, 787-4357. And I can also, when you call, let you know about how to access some of our past webinars that are posted online, as well as information about and phone numbers about the counseling and care or sort of support groups that are available. So feel free to call that number. I do have a couple of last minute questions here. Somebody is, I'm just going to stop sharing that. Somebody was asking about feeling guilty when people are taking care of you, so that the patient, I guess, having a sense of guilt when caregivers are helping out. And
yeah, and you know, I can really understand that feeling of, maybe not wanting people to kind of not wanting to be in a position of needing that help, and maybe seeing the effect of that help and how it might be causing strain or changes in the relationship, and having those feelings of guilt, I think is really common and understandable.
Mm-hmm. And that's okay. I mean, like to accept the help and to acknowledge that there's still some guilt in accepting the help, that you might feel conflicted.
Absolutely.
And that's okay. Yeah, it doesn't mean that because you feel guilty that you should refuse the help, but just that you can feel guilty and still accept the help.
Yes.
Again, this is a difficult question, and about talking to family about end of life planning. So you mentioned about, in the case of advanced cancer, doing some advanced care planning, and that's something that people may want to talk about with a counselor, or talk about more on an individual basis.
Yeah, and it's something that might also come up with your medical team, and it can be a conversation that can be done with the medical team, in addition to a counselor.
Okay, as well as like the family members, involving the family members.
Yes, and that is a decision for the patient, right? Who they might want to involve, and to what extent.
Okay. Is counseling available online or in person?
So counseling is primarily available online right now. So we're offering supports virtually and over the phone.
Okay.
And I think if either of those are a barrier, I would encourage you to bring those up to the counselor you're working with to kind of see what options might make more sense.
And one more question about, how do you get support from your family doctor? So same way that you would ask for support from other people in your life, in terms of just sharing your feelings or asking for what you need. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a great way to start, to say, this is a situation that, this is what's going on, this is what I'm feeling, and starting that conversation. And it can be, I just want to say again how hard it can be to start those conversations. But even just to say, I attended a webinar and I heard about these feelings and I'm relating to these feelings. And I think it might be a good idea for you to know that I'm feeling them.
Mm-hmm. So even with your family doctor, you could have that conversation in order to. Yeah.
I would think so. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Melanie, for being here today and answering these questions, and sharing your thoughts with us. It's a great discussion, and that's really what it is just a really thorough discussion, because there are no, as you say, no kind of rules about how to do any of this or any steps to follow. It's just, it's a complicated process and involves a lot of difficult feelings, and I really, really appreciate you being here. I would like our audience to take a moment to complete our evaluation. Your feedback is really important to us. That's how we came to do this webinar today, was based on feedback we'd received in the past about the need for a webinar for caregivers and connecting throughout the cancer journey. So please take a moment to complete the survey. You will be prompted at the end of the webinar. And do get in contact if you would like more information. Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And just also even for having this webinar, for giving space to these important questions and concerns. This is just so great that we could do this.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us, and take care for now.